Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss what German Chancellor Angela Merkel has had to say to journalists ahead of Germany taking over the presidency of the EU during the crucial last 6 months of the transition period. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, a couple of things before I start. First of all, the importance of the EU presidency. The country that holds the presidency decides the agenda for the EU. So they decide where the focus is going to be. They don't get to decide what the EU decides. Obviously, each individual member state does that, but they control the agenda. So what Angela Merkel has to say about Germany's priorities is going to be absolutely key. And she was, as I say, answering questions on her priorities for the EU with journalists, including The Guardian from this country, but other European ones as well. But I'm going to begin on a bit of an update to something I was talking about earlier this week, because we know we're not going to get a deal. That's just gone. So what people were thinking in terms of is, okay, so what's the compromise going to be? And you know, in other words, what is the potential fiddle for the UK to agree to EU standards in a way that still allows them to sell something as a great deal back home? And there was something I was talking about earlier this week that was being reasonably heavily publicised in some sections of the media, even the sensible media, about agreeing to those EU standards, but because we're going to diverge from them, accepting that when we do diverge from them, the EU will be allowed to impose or change tariffs when those standards are dropped, or at the very least lessened. Now, this idea originally came from Brexiteers in the UK. It was a Brexit Ear idea. I said in the video, I didn't see how it was in the EU's long-term interest to do it. But the idea has now had cold water poured on it since, and from the UK side. So that will be that done. David Frost, acting for Boris Johnson, of course, as Britain's chief negotiator, said that the idea wouldn't be acceptable to the UK government. And actually, I'd agree. As I said before, I mean, I could see how it would be a useful device for bashing the EU in perpetuity in order to distract from the fact that Brexit will have made us worse off. But it wasn't a solution to any problems on either side. And it seems like it was too much even for Johnson. So where this leaves us is in a position where any compromise seems unlikely. There is always talk, of course, of the government seeking a wafer-thin agreement, selling it as a major victory for Britain and a major climb down by the EU. In fact, you know, the very right-wing papers have already this week been talking about the EU backing down. Not quite sure what they think they've backed down over, but, you know, try and illuminate me. And of course, this is absolutely what Boris Johnson is hoping for. Something, anything at all, that he can just say, we've got this major concession, because most people won't read beyond that. But it's not going to fall into his lap, because Angela Merkel was reiterating the position of Germany that they want close economic ties to the UK, but that the integrity of the single market is absolutely of paramount importance. It is getting rather silly that people have to keep reminding us of this, but there it is. She said that the UK will have to live with the consequences of ditching the plan to maintain ties in favour of Boris Johnson's diverge at all costs and in all areas approach. Essentially, this is a statement that says a no-deal exit is the anticipated outcome in 6 months. Best get as ready as you can. The suggestion from the report from those that were at the press conference was that a compromise is no longer a possibility. That's what Angela Merkel has said. Compromise now is not going to happen. Forget it. Probably because one hasn't been forthcoming. And when you sort of consider the timetable, so we're coming up to summer. Parliaments will be disappearing off for summer. Ours certainly is. You could argue during the coronavirus pandemic, more sensible governments may decide that their parliaments, well, the parliaments themselves will have to decide ultimately that they'll carry on. But they're going to be dealing with coronavirus, not Brexit. There won't be enough time after Parliament's return to seriously discuss the remaining points and get it all ratified by the EU and the member states' parliaments, who are also still going to be busy with coronavirus. She said, this is a quote, "We need to let go of the idea that it is for us to define what Britain should want. That is for Britain to define, and we, the EU 27, will respond appropriately." And that is absolutely the right approach. I've said several times, in many ways, the EU should have taken this approach, I think, beforehand. I understand that they're fulfilling their obligations under the withdrawal agreement themselves. The negotiations have proven time and time again that Boris Johnson will just blame the EU for any lack of progress in talks ad infinitum. It will never end while the EU carries on talking. There has to come a point where the EU just say, do you know what? We're getting nowhere. You come and see us when you're prepared to actually propose something. And that cannot be emphasised enough. We have not produced a proposal. Sure, go onto the government website and there's a document that has the word proposal on the front cover. But that's just disguising the fact that it is anything but. But, people will just read that and go, oh, there's a proposal, look, without actually reading it. It's a bit like calling a country, I don't know, the Democratic People's Republic of whichever land the tyrannical dictatorship happens to occupy at the time. It's why Brexiteers bang on about freedom all the time, whilst they remove our rights one by one and get us to cheer it along, but not denying themselves the same rights. We notice Boris Johnson's father, Stanley Johnson, applying for a French passport so that, in his own words, his grandchildren will be able to live, travel and work in the EU. He wants rights for his family that is denying the rest of us. And Brexiteers have been doing this all along. Remember when Nigel Farage tried that trick? It's also why they talk about upgrading Britain whilst legislating to lower our standards. Put the lie in the title and most will never question it. But we haven't come up with a proposal for a comprehensive trade agreement, which is what we said we wanted in the withdrawal agreement. Arguing the toss is not going to get either side anywhere. So, quite frankly, yes, just tell Boris Johnson to stop pissing about until he's prepared to produce one. Then, as Merkel indicated, the EU will consider it appropriately. That's what she said. Until then, she has a rather more pressing situation to deal with, the coronavirus pandemic. This is what she said her priority for the EU was. And it is, for two very good reasons. One, as damaging as a no-deal Brexit is for all concerned, and more so for those nearer the eye of the storm, the economic and social cost of the coronavirus is far higher, even for countries that have made a better fist of coping with it than some others. There's no doubt in that. Brexit, hugely damaging, coronavirus, way off the scale. Secondly, Boris Johnson is not giving any indication of wanting to seriously negotiate a deal anyway. So even if the EU did prioritise Brexit, it's hard to believe that the outcome would be any different. So they'd be just wasting their time. What do people think that the EU can actually do that will result in anything other than what's going to happen anyway? I can honestly think of nothing. You could see this with the frustration of Michel Barnier during the press conference after the last round of talks, where he had to point out sections of the withdrawal agreement that Britain was refusing to pursue. So I think Merkel's done the only sensible thing, objectively speaking. There is no point in trying to sound a conciliatory tone with a country whose government is determined to attack them at every turn. That is not what a good working relationship can ever be founded on. And as a Briton, I am personally pleased as well, because frankly, as damaged as this is going to be, the only way the nightmare of Brexit can possibly end, sooner rather than later, is with a head-on conflict. If the EU take a softer approach and effectively cover for Johnson, you know what's going to happen. He'll sell it as this great victory back home. And if you think people will notice the lowering standards and go, hang on a minute, you said our standards were raised. People keep voting in these Conservative government. Standards have been lowering for the last 10 years. People are aware of this. They still vote for them. You just end up with long-term weak relations between the two sides. That's no good. Johnson has to fail and fail hard. And not just on a personal level. On a personal level, he's doomed anyway. A combination of Starmer and his own incompetence being highlighted due to the coronavirus are going to see to that. But just as the Brexiteers need the EU to fail in order to win, they keep saying, oh, the EU's weakening, it's going to go any time now. When's it going to go? Any time now. They've been saying this for years. And in the years that they've been saying that, the EU, the free trade area has become much larger. It's become much more politically important. It's come to the point now where multinational American companies refer to the EU law as the global standard on standards. You know, so yeah, I mean, if anything happens that allows Johnson to hide the fact that we've got nowhere, if the impact of Brexit can be denied for another 10 years, it'll surely take a very long time after that for the British population to realise what's happened, because it'll be if it's too gradual, you don't notice. People won't see it for what it is. Now, I don't want to read too much into Merkel's words, of course. They will be her intentions, not necessarily the intentions of the whole EU. But as I say, that being said, as president, Germany sets the agenda for the EU over the rest of 2020, and that agenda is going to be coronavirus. This is why David Cameron began our descent into dumbest country in the G20 when he turned down the chance to take the EU presidency himself when it was Britain's turn, just after the referendum. We could have taken control of the agenda early on and got the things that we wanted to discuss on that and focus the EU on it. We could have turned that to our advantage. But no. I mean, British diplomats were face-palming everywhere when Cameron turned it down. Fundamentally, we had a moron in charge of the government at the time. And just to see how far we've come, this is how far we've come. There's a lot of people wish David Cameron was still in charge. That's where we've come. But there it is. But what we can be sure of, I think, is that senior members of the EU are not going to be spending any time on Brexit nonsense beyond the usual smile and wave photo ops that you would do for any head of government, just the usual diplomatic niceties, until and unless Boris Johnson comes up with something worth looking at. This is Merkel saying that it's a no-deal Brexit coming this January, which she will deal with as she and others have prepared for, and she'll be focusing on dealing with the more impactful and urgent pandemic in the meantime. So that's the situation. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. Until next time, I'll see you later.